To celebrate us releasing our range of stabilisers, we've made a hanger to hold all the stabilisers in. So we just basically put a roll in between the layers. They have like a cubby hole or a post box type tube, which you can stack up by hanging onto a hanger and then just load it up with your stabiliser. So we've got embroidered some panels. We want to line the panels just by putting a piece of lining on the sides of the panel, not on the short sides, just with a 1/2 inch seam. And we're going to leave the ends open for the time being. Just inside the perimeter stitching line, so as you get a, well, I'll say a generous 1/2 inch seam. We want the lining to be nice and flat, so it's the same shape and size as the outside panel, which has got 1/2 inch seams around the outside edge of it. Then we turn it through. The striped fabric is the lining, and then we have our quilting on the outside, which is basically a shadow quilting with dual row of stitching. Quite fun. I've just made some plain blocks for this demonstration. I haven't put the names on them. So, we want to apply our hanger tapes at the top. So, one in the middle, and one at either end. Sit them in between a 1/4 to 1/2 an inch in from the edge. It doesn't matter. These have just been loops that have been made up, and then we've just tacked them at the end to keep them together, and then we're going to actually sew them within the seam allowance as a machine basting stitch is used, just to keep them into position so as it's nice and easy to work with. They are then secured by an extra row of stitching because the stabiliser, once loaded into this holder, is quite heavy, so it needs to be quite secure to hang from these hangers. So just machine basting them into place with a normal stitch length within the seam allowance. So there we are. So that edge seam there is now closed. What we want to do is we want to join it to its buddy, which will be the back. So one is closed and one is still open. So what we'll do is turn this inside out, and we'll slip the closed one inside, and we'll sandwich it between the two layers and stitch it along that seam with all the seams even. Just pin that into position so as that finished seam inside is right on that seam allowance. Bring it right on. Now, you can sew this seam all in one go, or you can do it in 2 steps. The idea is to hold those 2 quilted layers together and leave the lining free for the time being. We're going to stitch on the stitching line, or just inside the stitching line, making sure it's nice and flat. Let's put one more pin in. Keep those raw edges together so as they are flush. Do not catch the lining at this stage. Right. So this is the seam we're doing now. The top seam with the hangers that have been sandwiched in that seam, and we're finishing the actual seam on the inside as well. So don't catch the lining, and we're going to sew on our original stitching line, or just inside our original stitching line. Don't go past the stitches at the beginning. Don't go into the seam allowance. We're going to start at those stitches that are on the seam allowance. So what we're doing was we're calling sewing to the net, means that we do not sew into the seam allowance. We stop at the stitching. Keep the lining free. Don't catch it. And sew up to the stitching so as your needle just grazes the very edge of the underneath panel, which is being sandwiched into the seam. Secure it with a back tack trim. Right. So now, I wouldn't normally turn this out, but I want to show you what we're doing. See, we've just done this outside seam. And that seam is still free. Let's turn it back inside out again, like we had it. I wouldn't turn it through to look at it like I've just done this now. This is just for your visual on what we're actually doing. Make sure all our edges are flush, and we're just going to sew along our original row of stitching again. And that will just sandwich one panel into the other, so the seams will sit all in one direction, doesn't matter which. Right, let's turn it through. This is such a simple way of doing it, is enveloping or sandwiching panels. Very simple. So this is what I call the roof of the house. So it's going to be a little V shape. Okay, so nice and secure, nice and firm. See, there's our roof of our house. The next thing we want to do is put the base unit onto this particular piece, so as that we've got something for the rolls to sit on. That's the divider between the different sections in this hanger. So basically we're going to just catch these seams all together each side, and then we go through the process of sandwiching the next panel onto it. So it's the same process all the way along, as you'll see. Make sure your quilting is up. I had that wrong before. Make sure the quilting is up. Using your original row of stitching, keeping all your edges flush. Stitch your base panel to your outer panel, which is your top panel, and you're stitching through all layers. We're just keeping this base panel or divider or separator into position. The raw seams will be enclosed inside the next section when we add it on. Okay, so there's where our roll will go through. It's a very, very simple technique. If you're confident to do these sections all in one go when we're doing the sandwich, just do so. I mean, you don't have to do it in 2 stages if you don't want to. Keep all those outside edges even. Sew on our original row of stitching, which is our perimeter line of our embroidery. There we have our first section complete. You can add as many or as little as you want, depending on how much space you've got. So there we are, that's the holder. That's holding that. Now you can see we've got raw edges on both sides. So when we put our next layer on, we're going to turn that through and sandwich one side of the base to that next panel. Make sure they're nicely tucked up to the ends. Keep it even. It's a bit of push and pull sometimes with these panels, because it all depends on how much you've taken as your seams, how thick your batting is, whether you stretched your stabilizer when you put it into your hoop when you were doing your initial embroidery. So keep that tucked totally up close to that seam. as long as you've got a seam to sew by, which you have, which the base panel is going to give you a seam to sew by. Now, sometimes some machines just do not like starting on bulk, and I do get that. So you turn your work around, and when you've got a seam to follow, just stitch up for about half a dozen stitches, sink your needle, pivot, and then re-stitch over those stitches, and you haven't had to use your reverse function. Some machines do balk at the bulk that this corner might give you. Use your existing stitching lines that are the perimeter lines on these panels as a guide. We're working with about a 1/2 inch seam. Okay, so we've just run off that corner there and grazed the edge of that panel. Tuck that in. You want to feel that bulk. There shouldn't be too big a step there. Bring our edges out, pop a couple of pins in. And then stitch down the stitching line again. Don't worry too much about over stitching on one line, because basically you want security to hold the weight for your rolls. We've left enough space for you to have more than one roll, so you could have a roll as a new roll and one that you're using, because generally, if you're like me, you have more than just one of everything. There we are. There's our next panel added on. That's the front. Then we want to add one onto the back. And we can then carry on. So it creates our little partitions for all the different brands. You don't have to put the writing on. Now, the bottom one, we've actually put 3 panels instead of 2, because our bag stiffener is quite a big roll. And we just wanted to make sure that it could get in there quite comfortably. So we joined them in the same manner, except for one of them, I just used fabric glue to actually stitch the seam down of the lining once completed, so as that it was nice and neatly finished inside. You could hand stitch that down if you wished. You could even machine it down if you wished. It's not going to be seen really. And it's as long as it's nice and secure to hold the weight of the rolls, it's fine. Pulling the work through 2 panels is a little bit harder than using the 3 panels. We've got different styles. We've got scissors and pin cushions and thread, and we've got our 5 different divisions with our words, which are optional whether you want to use or not. Hope you enjoy this. We've enjoyed creating it.